Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 20 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks have lost 4-0. So once again, the Sharks will fail to get a 2-0 season series sweep over a team. The Sharks will fail to get a winning streak at all started this season with this loss here. Now, in the end, I guess the loss doesn't feel all too bad, as the Sharks hung around with the Colorado Avalanche for a while, and the fact that they end up getting the split against such a very, very skilled team is still somewhat of an accomplishment. And as I had already mentioned a few games ago, when the Sharks were coming into this stretch of games against the Blues, against the Golden Knights, against the Avalanche, I had said we shouldn't put too much emphasis on how the Sharks actually come out with in terms of a record, as they'll be able to make it up down the line against the weaker teams of the division. So with this season series split, it actually isn't all that bad. This first period starts off pretty 50-50, I would say, maybe slightly tilted in favor of the Avalanche, but not really anything to write home about, and it was a 0-0 game after 20 minutes. In the second period, the Avalanche began to push a bit more, and the ice would begin to tilt much more in their favor, and eventually they would get the first goal of this game coming from Mikko Rantanen to have a 1-0 lead after that period. Coming into the third period, we'd see if the Sharks would have such an amazing response as they did in the previous game against the Avalanche, but in the end, it wouldn't end up happening. Girard would make it 2-0 Avalanche, and then a major penalty, which I will talk about a bit later in this video, ended up being called against the San Jose Sharks. The Avalanche would get the 5-minute power play. They would score on said power play from Landeskog to make it 3-0, and eventually Rantanen would add another to make it 4-0, and that would be our final score. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. He comes right back between the pipes here tonight. Not a surprise after his very nice performance in the previous game against the Avalanche. However, here tonight, he took a bit of a step back from that previous game. It was still certainly a much better performance than what we saw from Devan Dubnyk in that game 2 games ago against the St. Louis Blues. However, not that great. It's funny, though, the 2 last goals that the Avalanche scored, goals 3 and 4, which didn't necessarily matter all too much, for the the final outcome of this game, were 2 goals that Jones definitely or probably couldn't have had. Very tough saves. That third one on Landeskog bouncing off of the stick of Kadri, allowing Landeskog to be able to corral it, as well as that Rantanen one coming off the backboards in a great play by Rantanen. However, the first 2 goals of this game, this first one from Rantanen, Jones didn't have a ton of time to get set, but he definitely could have made that save. And the one on Girard, he probably should have made that save absolutely from that far out, even with a somewhat screen, I guess, in front from Evander Kane. So 2 goals Jones probably could have had, 2 goals Jones probably couldn't have had. So all in all, a pretty average night for Martin Jones' sake, but from a natural goalie perspective in the NHL, not so great. Next thing to talk about would be the Sharks' first line. Now, I've mentioned so many times this Sharks' first line has been very consistent for San Jose the past few games. They have been far and away the Sharks' best line game in and game out, more or less. However, here tonight, they definitely did struggle. Now, it's hard to actually, expect so much out of your first line consistently when you're having to go against a lot of the times Landeskog, McKinnon, and Rantanen as a first line. Obviously, that's one of the best first lines, one of the best lines in the entire NHL, not just this division. And so eventually you are going to end up getting a bit overwhelmed. That ended up being the case here tonight. Hopefully those 3 players can have a bit of a bounce back game on Friday against an even tougher, or at least equally as tough opponent, and a bigger rival at the very least. Next, I'll be talking about Alex True. He actually made his season debut in the previous game, but I was so overwhelmed with so many different players to talk about, I ended up sort of glancing over his 6 minutes that he got in the previous game. But those 6 minutes were still pretty decent. Here tonight, also, a pretty solid performance from Alex True. There was one play in particular that I really enjoyed. He had a very, very nice back check to prevent the Colorado Avalanche from actually getting a shot away, which would have been a very, very good shot when this game was still very close as well. I think it was maybe 1-0 at the time. And I think True maybe put a bit too much into that back check. He lifted the stick, which was very nice. I think he ended up taking a what should have been, in my opinion, at the very least, a hooking penalty, though he didn't end up getting called for it. But in the end, I loved the effort for that back check, and that's something, honestly, we haven't seen from that many Sharks players. A lot of the times, the other team would score on the rush, and you'd watch the replay, and you'd say, well, that forward probably could have got back if he actually tried to skate for it. But so it was nice to see that Alex True was really putting in the effort to get back defensively. That was at least one thing that I noticed from him. So a pretty decent game from True, and those are the types of things that will definitely allow you to, more consistently be placed in the lineup. And finally, I will talk about Joachim Blickfeld as he got his first game of the NHL season here tonight. And, based on play-wise, he was also pretty decent on this line with True, had a couple of decent opportunities, looked okay, wasn't necessarily too pressured in his own defensive zone, but obviously the main thing to talk about when it comes to Blickfeld is the major penalty I mentioned earlier. So this is one taken by Blickfeld. He gets called for a hit to the head of Nathan MacKinnon at around halfway through this third period, and after a video review, the refs confirmed that it was a major penalty. He took the 5, and the Sharks had to go down a man for the full 5 minutes, and as I said, the Avalanche scored on that to make it 3-0, and that more or less put the game away. Now the question is, should this have been a major penalty? And it may be my bias speaking and coming as an influence into this, but I didn't necessarily think this should have been the 5-minute penalty it ended up being. It's actually quite funny because a few years back, just a couple years back, you couldn't actually review these 5-minute penalties. If someone got called for 5 minutes, that was just sort of the end-all be-all. But it was actually in a San Jose Sharks game where a major penalty occurred, and I don't think I have to remind anyone about this, which was the Game 7 against the Vegas Golden Knights. I believe it had been Paul Stastny or Cody Eakin. One of those two players ended up taking this penalty against Joe Pavelski. Pavelski got injured, headed to the dressing room. The refs called him for 5 minutes, and upon further review, many hockey pundits felt as though this should not have been a 5-minute penalty and should have instead been the 2-minute penalty. But in the end, the 5-minute power play gave the Sharks the opportunity to make the comeback in that game and win it in Game 7. Of course, as I said, I don't have to remind anybody about that. And so starting at the next season, the NHL instated the rule that for 5-minute major power plays or penalties, the refs would have the opportunity to review it to try and get it right because of how much of an influence a 5-minute power play that isn't ended by a power play goal can have on a game, like we did see in that Game 7. And so here tonight, watching this in real time, it of course looked like this was a dangerous hit to the head by Blickfeld, and I'm not at all surprised nor upset that the referees ended up originally calling this 5 minutes. You see Nathan MacKinnon, a star player, down on the ice, and you think that this is a hit to the head. Obviously, to be safe, you escalate it up to 5 minutes because you cannot review a 2-minute penalty and then make it 5 minutes if you get it wrong, but you can go the other way around. However, upon video review, to me, I look at this and I look at the angles and I see the head does not seem to be the principal point of contact of this hit. It seems as though it's a shoulder-to-shoulder that sort of rides in to the head of Nathan MacKinnon, who of course has his head down. It also doesn't seem as though Blickfeld at all leans into this hit. It doesn't seem as though he's like predatorily going for a hit like this. He doesn't jump into it either. And of course, this isn't necessarily Michael Haley or Rafi Torres laying a hit like this, where you question the intention of trying to lay a hit on a player in a semi-vulnerable position. This is Joachim Blickfeld, who is supposed to be at the very least a scoring type of player. He's not the Alex Ovechkin type scoring player, but he's at the AHL level a scorer. He is a goal scorer and all those things. He is not a dirty player. I mean, this is probably like the first hit he's ever laid in his NHL career, and so to think that he was doing this in any way predatorily is kind of crazy to me. And so I really thought this should have ended up only being 2 minutes, and it ended up being 5 in the end. It'll be interesting to see what the NHL decides to do. Now, I should also mention, maybe this is me just sort of putting on my tinfoil hat, but you take it when you're from a ref's perspective here, you take a look at who it was laying the hit from San Jose. It's Joachim Blickfeld, a player who is not well known around the league at all. Only some Sharks fans, not even all Sharks fans would necessarily know who he is. Some Sharks fans will know who he is. Meanwhile, Nathan MacKinnon is a household name. He is one of the best players in the NHL, a top 3 center, at least top 5 center in the entire league. And so you see him go down with what could be a potential injury. Who knows how long term that may or may not be. You maybe want to send a message, and considering it's Joachim Blickfeld, as I said, that message is not necessarily hugely detrimental to the San Jose Sharks. Had this been, let's say, Alex Ovechkin laying a hit like this onto Nathan MacKinnon, maybe this gets reduced to the 2 minutes. Again, this is maybe a bit of a tinfoil hat theory, and upon by the tomorrow we'll see whether or not this will be a suspension. I honestly wouldn't be too surprised, because again, you send a message here of, don't touch our star players, without really having to send a message, because suspending Joachim Blickfeld isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world for the San Jose Sharks. But In the end, I don't think he necessarily deserves it, but again, maybe that's just my bias speaking. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday. As I said, they will take on the Vegas Golden Knights, and it should be hopefully a good hockey game, but also a very tough one, and it will be the first of a back-to-back series against that team. Class dismissed.